Hey there everybody, welcome to Tucktuk's Trinkets and Terrain. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I created the Yawning Portal, that famous tavern located in the city of Waterdeep. Wizkids announced that they are coming out with a licensed, pre-painted plastic version of the Yawning Portal, which is part of the reason why I was inspired to make this, but this is a long video, so let's get right into it. Thank you so much for stopping by, I hope you enjoy.
Alright, as you can see, this is the Wizkids official Yawning Portal set that's coming out. It's got the main level with the bottomless pit and the two sort of U-shaped upper levels. This is what I based my build on. So I went ahead and drew a sketch of kind of what I wanted to do based on the model itself. It was really easy to get the measurements as it is gridded. So yeah, here's my bottom level on the right and my two upper levels on the left. I've marked out where the stairs go, the different columns, the bar, fireplace, a little stage in the back corner, just to give me an idea of what I want to do while I'm building. So the base, I'm going to use this, I think it's like an exercise mat, and then I cut out all my wall pieces out of dollar store foam board, and then the columns are going to be just normal XPS foam. And I've pre-cut all this. For the floor, I decided to use popsicle sticks. The dense foam on the base is pretty hard to carve into, so just to give me some ease, I'm going to use popsicle sticks. I started off by gluing on my back wall section with just some hot glue, and then glued on a wall section to make sure everything was square. Again, just using hot glue. This base sheet is pretty flexible. So I wasn't too concerned about making sure everything was perfect. You can see here I'm using a carpenter square to just make sure everything is close to square. And then I started gluing down popsicle sticks, just hot glue straight on the stick, and then lining them up as best I can, trying to avoid misshapen sticks as I go, setting those aside to cut those up into smaller pieces for later. At this point, I've measured out where all my pillars are going to go, and then I glue those down with some hot glue, and then I go ahead and start laying down more popsicle sticks around the columns. After that, I cut out some more pieces of dollar store foam board for the stage that's going to go in the back right. After peeling the paper off, I textured it with a brick pattern using this foam roller that I 3D printed. Just makes a nice, quick and easy, good-looking brick pattern that's nice and consistent rather than me trying to hand carve it. I hot glued all these together into sort of a triangle shape that's going to go in the corner. And then once those pieces were all glued together, I used a pencil to continue the brick pattern along the edges of the foam, just to make sure that it was consistent all the way through the material. And once that was all done, I hot glued it in place over the popsicle sticks. You can see I've jumped ahead here and filled in all the spaces with smaller pieces. Now for the top of this floor, I wanted something that the second floor is going to rest on. So I cut out some thin pieces of XPS foam that I've textured with a wire brush to give it a wood texture. And I'm going to hot glue those in along the top of the first floor, along the walls here. This is not only going to give it a cool detail, but it's also going to be what the second floor rests on once you set it down. So I do that on all three walls. You can see the stage back there is not going to have this, just because that goes all the way up to the top of the first floor. So after that was glued in, I wanted to give the walls some details, so I cut some more popsicle sticks, a little shorter, and you can see I marked out, it was like every couple inches along the walls to give a visual detail to the walls rather than just being a big blank wall section here. I glued those all around the outside on all three walls. Alright, with the popsicle sticks glued into the walls, I somehow measured wrong or cut them wrong or something, but there ended up being a little gap between the top wood beam and the popsicle sticks. So to cover that, and again just add a little more visual interest to the walls, I cut a smaller, thinner piece of XPS foam, and again textured it with a wire brush to give it a nice wood grain, and then glued that underneath the top sort of wood frame piece there. You'll find a pattern in this video where a lot of the things that I end up doing are to cover up mistakes or inaccuracies with measurements or cutting materials or whatnot. Alright, with the walls all taken care of, I grabbed some joint compound, spread out some on each different wall section. This probably should have been done before the popsicle sticks were glued on, and then I could have pressed the popsicle sticks into the wet joint compound, but I didn't think that far ahead. But you can see I'm using a popsicle stick to sort of scrape the wet joint compound and make it look like it was smeared onto the wall, rather than me trying to stab at it with a paintbrush. This worked fairly well. It's not perfect, but it gets the point across, I think. So before we continue with the base structure, I needed to make the stairs. Now there are 4 stairs, 2 on the first floor, 2 on the second floor, so I made all these at the same time. And then I cut a bunch of popsicle sticks that are going to be the steps. I measured out where I wanted each step going up in a spiral along the center column there, and then with an X-Acto blade, I pre-scored each spot where the steps were going to be. One on the left, the next one slightly higher in the middle, and the next one slightly higher on the right. And then going around in a spiral all the way up the stairs. My hope here was that pre-scoring it would help the foam not tear and break as much as I pushed these in. It helped for the most part. There were still some issues with this. And then to secure them, I just used a bit of tacky glue as I pushed them into the foam. As I did this, went around, I tried to make them as even as possible, as straight as possible. I think there was definitely a better way to do this. This is just the way that I thought of at the time. You can see I've got one stair completely done. I'm just trying to even out all the steps. After these steps were all dry, I grabbed some square toothpicks and glued on some little metal rings. These are going to end up as the railing around each of the staircases. I just used some hot glue between the metal ring and the toothpick. I tried using super glue, but I just couldn't get it to stick. If I had some accelerant, it probably would have helped, but I don't have any, so I just ended up using hot glue. It ends up being fine, as I paint everything a metallic color, and it sort of ends up being sort of a metal cap on top of the wood. After those were all done and assembled, I glued those on every other step, and this is where I ended up at this stage. Next up, I decided to use the joint compound to fill in all of the holes that the stairs had torn into the foam here. My thought was that if there are wood columns in the back, maybe the stair columns are covered in plaster to make them a little nicer, since guests are going to be walking along those regularly. And then for the railing, I just used some twine, tied it to the top there, and fed it through each of the rings in succession, and then tied it off at the bottom. Nice and simple, didn't need to be fancy here. And once all those were all done with the construction, I base coated them with some Mod Podge and black paint mixed together to make sure everything was secure, and hot glued them into place on our first floor. It was at this point that I realized that this maybe wasn't the best way to do the structure here. I wanted this to be at least somewhat playable, so I went ahead and lopped off all of the foam that is making up the walls, with the intention of making a big first floor as well as a big second and third floor pieced together, so that they're two sort of equally big pieces that can be stacked on top of each other. But we'll get back to the second and third floors later. As you can see, I jumped ahead here. I base coated everything in black, and then all the wood pieces in brown. So all of the floors, the wood beams on the walls, as well as the steps on the stairs. For the stage, I painted it a dark red color for the bricks, and then for all of the wall plaster, I painted it a tan color as its base coat. I tried to keep this paint job very simple. I didn't want to spend too much time on it, as it was a very large piece. For the stage, I picked a few random colors. I think it was a bright red, a brown, and then a gray, and just picked out bricks at random to give it a little more interest, make the bricks more varied. I didn't want this piece to end up being just a big blob of brown on the table, so I figured the red color with all the different bricks would be a nice visual interest to the overall piece. After a very heavy black wash over everything, I dry brushed with a light gray over 100% of the piece just to make it nice and simple. The floors, the plaster, everything. And with that, our base is done. The next piece that I'm going to show you is the fireplace. So it's just pretty simple, nice square with a bunch of XPS foam pieces that I once again textured with the brick foam roller, the same as the stage that we did. Glued all these together and then used a bit of dollar store foam board for the backing here. I then went and made a very simple circuit with a couple of watch batteries, on-off switch, as well as a flickering LED with the intention of putting some flames over this. I stuck it through the bottom of the fireplace here and secured it with some hot glue. I also squirted out some extra hot glue here to sort of build up the area around it, like there's been a lot of fires in this fireplace. Once this had all cooled, I flocked the bottom of the fireplace with some PVA glue and some sand. These are going to act as our coals and all the burnt down ashes and whatnot. Spread out the glue with a brush just to give it a nice, more even coverage. I did focus on the center here, and then I flocked it with some sand. Dumped off all the extra, and that gives us a nice coal base. After basing everything with some black Mod Podge once again, I painted this almost identically to the stage. I did cut out a chimney here. It's just, again, just a solid piece of XPS foam, textured exactly the same way with the roller. I made this before I ended up deciding to cut the piece in half, so I do end up separating these pieces together. You see I'm gluing them here. I then painted this exactly the same as the stage, a dark red base coat, picked out some random bricks with grays, browns. I think I did not do the red on this one. Like I said, I did this one before the stage, but it still gives the same effect with the random bricks painted out in the 3 different colors. Did a black wash over everything, and then a dry brush with a light gray to pick out all the nice brick texture that roller gets us. After the bricks were all done and painted, I took a bright red and did a sort of a, not quite an overbrush, but not quite a dry brush, but did it over the coals here to make it look like they are glowing. And then I picked out a few spots with a yellow to make it look like there's some brighter ones in there, around the center where sort of the most heat would be. I then, off camera, went and made some hot glue flames. I showed how I did this in my Gate to the Underdark video. You can check that out via the tag in the corner there, but it's pretty simple. You just carve up some hot glue, paint it like flames, nice and easy. But I took the biggest one here, and I'm going to use my hot glue gun to bore a hole into the middle of it. This is going to slot over the LED light and mask that. And then with that in place, I painted up a bunch of random leftover cutoffs from popsicle sticks and barbecue skewers and whatnot. Painted all those brown, and then I'm going to dry brush these exactly like the flames, with red first, then an orange, then a yellow to make it look like they're glowing. And these are going to build up the bulk of the wood in the fireplace. Just use some tacky glue to glue all these down. Do my best to make them sort of clumped together in the middle here. I wasn't too precise with this. I figured this is a busy tavern, lots of people. The workers are probably just tossing logs in here towards the center. These are just stacked haphazardly around the center flame here. I did try to keep in mind the other flames that I needed to glue on, so I left a few empty spaces around the center flame there. And then with all of the wood glued down, I glued down all the flames, trying to make it look random. Obviously this is not what an actual fire would do, but this is what I had on hand, and it looks good to me. Used some tweezers to just do a couple precise moves. After those were all glued in, I figured that this is a very large fireplace in a tavern. People could just stumble right in, no problem. So I grabbed some cross-stitch mesh and cut a piece to fit, and you can see I cut out the top row there just to give it a little more interest, make it look a little more fancy. And then again, just using some tacky glue, I'm going to glue that into the front of the fireplace here as sort of a barrier or a gate to prevent people from getting too close. And then once all the glue was dry, I just did a overbrush with a metallic gunmetal color to give it sort of a wrought iron look. And with that, our fireplace is ready to be glued in to the building itself.
Sorry for interrupting the build here, but I just wanted to do a quick call to action. If you're enjoying the video so far, please leave a like button. I really do appreciate it. At the time of recording this, I have 95 subscribers, and once we get to 100, I really want to do a small giveaway of a few dungeon tile type things, so please subscribe. We only need 5 more subscribers to do that. So once that happens, be on the lookout for a video announcing that small giveaway. So let's get back to it and finish up this build.
Alright, next up is the bar for the tavern. So you can see the main structure is XPS foam that I've cut in various shapes, with the skinny pieces of the back forming some shelves. I also cut some strips of chipboard to act as some sort of feature planks, and then as well as the cupboard doors on the back of the piece there. Now this is one of those cheap necklace chains that you get with like cheap jewelry, and if you cut those individually, they make really good fixtures for cupboards and whatnot. So I super glued those on the front of the chipboard pieces to make some handles. After that, I traced the shape onto some chipboard and cut that piece out. My plan here is to make sort of that mirrored surface that you get in sort of a stereotypical tavern bar sort of situation. So I glued some aluminum foil to my piece of chipboard, and then I set that aside while that dried, and I finished up the rest of the piece. Now for the large section on the bar there, I glued 2 Gatorade bottle caps together, and then I glued a very thin piece of XPS foam to the front of it. This was going to become a big barrel or keg of whatever alcohol is being served, and I wanted to have a nice wood texture on the front here. So using the back of my XPS knife, I instantly tore the foam, which is what I was trying not to do using the back, but I got some nice wood texture on the front of the foam here. And then I used a wire brush very gently to give the wood some grain. And then I wanted to have some metal banding around, so I cut a strip of flash card and hot glued that around the edge of the keg here. And you can see that fits nicely. It's a nice oversized keg. For the tap, I cut a piece of bendy straw at the elbow here, and I glued that to the front in a nice downward position, making sure to get the hot glue on the inside so that it didn't seep out and make it look all funky. And then I glued a tiny piece of straw to the top for the, I'm not sure what it's called, but like where the airflow is, so that whatever liquid's inside pours out easily. I then glued a small bead to the side of the tap to act as the nozzle or lever to open or close the tap. And then with some hot glue, I stuck that onto the bar itself. And you can see here that there is some weird gaps in each of the corners where realistically this keg would probably roll around willy-nilly. So I did glue some pieces of foam in the corners there. And with that, the construction is all done. After some more black paint and Mod Podge mix, I base coated all the wood in the same brown as the tavern itself. And then all the sort of wood trim pieces, I painted it in a darker brown to make them separate. I also painted the cupboard doors the dark brown. Then I painted the metal banding on the keg, as well as all the little knobs on the cabinets a gunmetal color, and then painted the tap a bronze. And then I just did a dry brush with a light gray over everything. I actually forgot to black wash this, but it ended up turning out just fine. I don't have any complaints with it. Next, I wanted to do some bottles and things. So here's a big old collection of beads. These pieces are actually pieces from a dollar store, like off-brand Light Bright kit. You can see if I cut them in half, they look pretty close to bottles. Here's some other random beads that I'm going to be using. Then these are some very tiny beads. I know they have a specific name, but I'm not sure offhand what it is. But they're going to act as my caps or corks or whatnot from my bottles. So just grabbing these plastic pieces, dipping them in some tacky glue, sticking them on randomly, trying to be varied and random with my colors and shapes. Doing the same thing with the random beads that I have, and then same method, dipping the little tiny beads in the glue and just placing those on top of all of the beads to act as the caps. I ended up finding some different colors, I think black and blue, so I used those to give the caps a little more color variation. And then on the front there, I actually have one like a bottle has been opened and ready to pour, so the cap is actually next to it. Once that was all dry, it was just a matter of hot gluing our mirrored back to the surface here. And with that, the bar is all done. This is definitely my favorite piece. I love the colors, all the bottles look really awesome. So I'm really happy with how that turned out. Next, we're moving to the upper floors. So as you can see, this is done exactly the same as the base floor here, with the popsicle sticks, the pillars. Then I also cut holes for where the stairs are going to come up, as well as where the chimney will be in the back there. Now for the sort of balcony area, I cut a bunch of pieces of XPS foam with the intention of gluing one to the side there and then one on top to form a sort of railing around the perimeter here. Hot glued all those on. Next, I cut some more pieces of flashcard, and with these I'm going to cover up all of the edges of the XPS foam to cover where the pieces are separate. So I just bent this over the foam to get the shape, and then hot glued those on each of the edges of the pieces here. See here, it's all finished. These I thought would be like the sort of metal bands that keep everything secure. I think it ended up being really awesome. Next, to add some more details to the railing and increase the height, I'm using some super glue, and I'm just going to glue these round beads on each of the metal pieces. And I want to point out that this is the second floor of the tavern. The third floor is going to be done identical. I'm just showing you the process of the second one, but the third floor is essentially exactly the same, except it doesn't have the pillars in the back because it's the top floor. After all of the beads were glued down to form the railing, I hot glued some metal rings onto each of them. And again, I struggle with some super glue here. I'm not sure what the issue was, but I just resolved to using hot glue with these metal rings, gluing them onto each of the beads to form the last of the posts. And then for the edges here, I opened up one of the metal rings and looped on my chain to secure it, and then closed the loop back up so it wouldn't go anywhere, and then simply just fed the chain through all of the loops, and did the exact same thing on the other side, hot gluing each of the rings to the very last bead. See here, that looks pretty good. I tried to make it as taut as possible so it wasn't droopy or move around too much. Next, I made a very simple railing for the stairwell here, using some offcuts of foam as the posts, and then some strips of chipboard for the top railing. I used the same beads that I used on the railings for the balcony here to form sort of caps on all of the tops of the posts. And then I did that for both sides. You can see, nice and simple, didn't need to be fancy here. I figured the stairs were going to be here, didn't want it to be too busy. After gluing the stairs down where they needed to go, I glued the top half of the wall section here that I cut off to the outer edge of my second floor. Next, I started to work on the walls of the tavern here. My thought process for this was with 2 additional floors. This floor, the second floor, is going to have full-size walls, and then the top floor is going to have the sort of half walls, with the thought that you could use one floor to play on with everything revealed. If there's ever like a battle or something that needs to be shown more, you'd use the top floor for that, and then anything that you want to keep secret or just use for show, you could use the second floor with the full walls. So just use some dollar store foam board here to make all my wall sections. I cut everything out first and then hot glued everything down where they needed to go. And then the rooms actually follow the curve of the balcony, so these corner rooms have an odd diagonal wall here, so I just beveled the edges on the wall piece to make it fit a little more flush, and just hot glued that in place to form that sort of larger corner room. Here is the third floor with all of the wall pieces glued on, just to get an idea. After that, it's the exact same paint job as the base structure with the browns, tans. I also did the joint compound on the walls for some texture. Then I glued the fireplace chimney in to its spot. And then with that, the second floor is pretty much done. I've obviously painted the third floor exactly the same as well. Next, we're moving on to the entrance. So these are going to be the pieces that form the front of the building. I decided to do a separate piece for these with the intention of playability, so these could be removed from the structure when the players eventually go inside the structure to check out the pit or whatever it is they're doing. So you see I pre-cut some foam board with some window slots, and then I also pre-cut the windows out of some cross-stitch mesh to fit inside all those holes. So you can see here the front of the building has these odd little vestibules on the front, so that is why I've cut the foam pieces like I have. And my plan here is to create a piece that sort of slides under the structure, and then these sort of fit like a puzzle piece onto the little vestibule area there. So I traced that shape onto some chipboard, and then using some painter's tape, I taped all my wall pieces together. This was to ensure that the bottoms were all flush, they would be straight. One ended up being a little too long, and I just trimmed that off nice and easy. This would also let it be flexible while I glued it in place, so I made sure that I got the right shape in order to fit around the vestibule area. I textured this with a different 3D printed roller. This is like a large cobblestone looking one. I really love these texture rollers. They definitely make up for my lack of skill when it comes to etching out carvings into foam. But that gives it a nice rock texture there. I also cut out a bunch of strips of chipboard with the intention of these being wooden support beams or just highlight pieces that cover the building. And they're also going to cover up the gaps that the foam is going to make when I fold them around the shape on the base here. So I hot glued that down, being careful to follow my trace lines here so that everything fit together nicely. And then once everything was hot glued down, I bent the chipboard pieces in half and glued those on each of the corners to give that little detail as well as hide the spaces, like I said. And that's what it looks like all glued up. Next, I grabbed some scrap foam board and a circle shape. This is just some flocking that I had on hand. And these are going to become the steps leading up to the door. I used the circle to trace out the shape on the foam, and then a smaller one to make the next step up. Turns out that the piece of exercise mat that I'm using for the base is exactly 2 pieces of foam board stuck together. So that was a nice, happy little coincidence. I'm using a smaller cobblestone roller to texture the stairs here. And then I'm going to use a metal tool to continue the rock break, but the spaces between the rocks on the edges. And then just hot glued that down where the door will eventually be. You can see I have cut the space for the door as well as trimmed that out with some chipboard, and I also laid some chipboard on the top to clean it up a little bit. Then I glued a little piece of foam above the center window here. This will eventually be the mounting point for a sign that's going to hang out in front of the tavern. You can see we've got sort of pieces of it in the back, but I will get to that in a little bit. Next, to fill in this gap between the door and the window there, I thought I would make a little planter. So I cut out some pieces of foam and glued those down. I don't have the footage, unfortunately, but I did fill that with glue and sand to give it a nice ground texture. And then to painting. So again, more black paint and Mod Podge. I did a dark brown base coat on all the wood on the outside here, as well as the planter and then painted all of the stone with just a nice simple gray, and then dry brushed the gray with a lighter gray, and then I dry brushed the wood pieces with a tan. After a black wash, I dry brushed everything with a very light gray, just like the inside, to sort of bring everything together, make it look a little more cohesive. Next I'm going to show you how I did my windows. You probably saw them in the background a little earlier, but using my cross-stitch meshing, I'm going to glue these down to this clear plastic piece with some glossy Mod Podge. My hope here was that the Mod Podge would cure inside each of the little spaces in the cross-stitch meshing to form little panes of glass, which worked okay. It dried a little thinner than I thought it would, but it ended up being pretty good looking overall. You can see here, this is it all dried, nice and clear, and I'm going to cut all of these out. And then I watered down some yellow paint. My intention here was to make it look like there was light coming through these windows, but it did not come across great once it had all dried. But I did really like how it looked, so I ended up keeping it even though it's not the most realistic looking. And then once those were all done, I glued those into each of the window spots using some tacky glue. You can also see I've glued in some doors into the spaces here. These are just my standard doors, nothing really fancy about them, just some foam board and chipboard features. If you are interested in these, I do sell these in my Etsy shop. You can check that out. There's a link in the description for that. I sell a bunch of small little dungeon tile-like things and accessories. If for some reason you don't have access to materials or tools or something, you can't make your own stuff, you can head on over to my Etsy and check those out. Next up, I'm going to show you how I made the simple little signs. They're going to hang off the front here. So I'm going to use these diamond beads and some pieces of, I think this is cereal box to make a little sort of sandwich. The beads in the middle and the cereal box on the outside to make a little sign. And I just super glued all those together. I then took some smaller lengths of chain and some more metal loops and attached those to each of the diamond beads so that it hangs nice and straight. For the post itself, just using a barbecue skewer, and then I glued a few beads on the end to make it a little more fancy looking. Here's these signs all painted up. You can see I sort of free-handed a mug symbol on it, and then I just used some tacky glue and poked that right into the foam. Off camera, I also glued on some moss on all the walls. I also threw on some flower patches in my planter there, and with that, the entrances are all done. Nice and colorful. The purple really adds a nice contrast to the gray wall sections. Alright, next up is a fairly simple little mini project here. The owner of the Yawning Portal famously has a magical greatsword hung up in the bar, so I wanted to make sure that was included as well. So I'm going to use this little diamond bead, a couple of pins, and this little model sword to create the mount for that magical sword. So I'm just using some super glue to stick it all together. The pins are acting as sort of the mounting point for the sword that it's propped up on. And then for the base itself, it's just a little piece of chipboard. You can see the intention here is just to glue this onto the front, give it a little extra visual interest. And then after painting everything up, the back is just some wood paint, and then everything on the front here is just painted in some various metal colors. I tacky glued those together, and that is all done. Alright, so last piece here is the giant pit that goes to the Underdark. So the intention here is to make an infinity mirror with essentially two mirrors next to each other with a light in between that creates infinite reflections. So these are all the pieces that I'm going to use for the crane part. This is the crane that sort of swivels out over the pit for the brave or foolish to get their thrills. This sort of reminds me of like a mechanical bull style attraction in this particular tavern. So you see I'm just sort of messing with these pieces here to get sort of an idea of what I want to do, making sure my gears kind of make sense for this crane that moves back and forth to ferry people out over the pit. The chain in the back is going to be what people stand on. I just glued some wood discs to the bottom there, nothing too crazy. And And then the electronics are actually from the previously mentioned dollar store Light Bright toy that I just ripped the battery pack and light out of so that I didn't need to do any extra work. So I'm going to start hot gluing things down. This big gear is going to be what the crane arm sits on. So I'm going to glue that down and then glue this block of foam onto the top of that, and then just continue the sort of gear work down to where somebody can spin this whole thing via lever. I use this little metal bit here from some electronic that I ripped apart at some point, bent that into shape to create a small little lever, and then just glue that in the center of the smallest gear on the side there. After that, I set about boring a hole into the middle of the foam here so that the crane arm can be attached. I'm just using this piece of wood. I honestly have no idea where this came from. It's just been sitting around in my crafting space for a while, so I figured this would be a good opportunity to use it. And I just use some hot glue to secure it to the foam. Then I'm going to hot glue some metal rings to the side here to give it sort of a fishing rod sort of look, which the chain will eventually be threaded through. I do trim this arm a little bit later. It ended up being too long to hang over the center of the pit, so that very last ring does get removed eventually. Alright, next up I set about preparing the base of the structure here. So I cut some foam circles, and then this is, it's called a crafting mirror. It's essentially just a mirror with no frame or backing or anything. I think they're like $5 on Amazon, pretty cheap. And I'm going to hot glue that down to this chipboard piece here. This is temporary. I just wanted to make sure that my foam circles here were the right shape. So I hot glued my circular pieces here. This broke on accident, but didn't particularly matter, still fit together nice. So with that in place, I tore up the mirror off of the foam, knowing that my circle was going to be fine, and then I glued the remaining piece onto the chipboard. So this is going to be the center of the structure. It sits in the slot that's been cut into the base that we did earlier. But then there needs to be sort of a rim around the top of this that's going to cover up a little bit of the popsicle sticks and create sort of a lip for everything to sit nicely. So I cut some small pieces of the same foam that I'm using, glued the popsicle stick to the top of these. This represents the total height of our main structure. And then I'm going to hot glue on our sort of outer ring lip piece here, using the spacers to make sure everything is the right height, make sure everything's flush, and that it fits nicely once it eventually goes into place. I wanted to keep this piece separate and fit into place because the on-off switch for the electronics is on the bottom, and since I didn't really want to do any more electronics works, I just left it. Figured that I would just keep this separate for making sure the batteries get replaced and stuff like that. So you can see here, my little crane is all finished. I did glue on some little wood bits to create sort of a winch system for the chain to go around. And I'm just making sure everything lines up here on the flat side of the circle. I then bored a hole into the side of the foam here for the light to go through, and then hot glued the crane into place, making sure that the bottom of the crane is flush with the bottom of the outer lip piece here, so that once everything was set down, it was flush with the ground level of the tavern itself. So this is a reflective film that's intended to go on windows to help keep sunlight out. This is just a thin piece of plastic, and what I didn't realize is that this is a static cling window film when I purchased it off of Amazon, so that's kind of unfortunate. I was expecting it to be adhesive, but I attached that to the piece of plastic and cut out a small shape, and then as you can see, I cut out another small piece of circular foam, very thin, that's going to cover up the edge of the sort of top reflective layer here. Because our infinity mirror is going to be looked down from the top, I had to buy this clear film that's reflective on one surface, so you could actually look into the mirror itself. Cut that out with the added width for the little foam pieces here, then hot glued the foam down to create the edge of the top layer here. So after everything is all painted up, this is just a really simple stone paint that I've shown before in my previous videos, and then obviously all the other little bits are painted up. I made another hot glue flame just like we did for the fireplace. This is going to cover up the LED light from our electronics. Unfortunately, this light is a very bright white bulb, so I did my best to essentially dull it as much as possible so it wasn't too bright. You can see I've glued a little piece of chipboard in as sort of a mounting spot for the flame here, and then the flame will cover up enough of the light that it won't be super bright and look at least somewhat realistic. Once that was in place, I threw down some white glue and spread it out, and then slotted the mirror into place at the bottom of our pit. And then using some more white glue, I attached the top layer. Weighed that down with some books while it dried to make sure it was all flat and there weren't any weird gaps. And you can see here with the light on, you get that awesome reflectiveness all the way down. Gives it a very big depth. It's not perfect because the film that makes the top layer isn't super reflective, but it gets the point across. All that is left is to string our chain through the crane arm and then loop it around our simple winch here at the bottom, and then just secured that with some white glue to make sure it didn't go anywhere. And with that, everything got put together and is complete. So here is the bottom layer. You see the front pieces here get removed so that you can see more clearly and reach your hands in there to move minis around and whatnot. You can see I've thrown a bunch of tables and barrels and whatnot. You can see our foolhardy or brave patron is dangling over the pit. The stage in the background there has a performer. Our flames are flickering on our fireplace. You can see I glued some beads to the top of it just to give it a little more visual interest. I've also glued some simple beads onto some of the walls and painted them up just to give them sort of a lantern effect. Our sword is glued to the wall on that side. And then let's go to the second level. So we've got our stairs. I've also added some doors into the walls for each of the rooms. I've got another smaller bar set up here with some more tables and patrons. And see the other stairwell here with some more lanterns on the walls. And then here is our top level with the short walls for playability. If you're interested in seeing any of these furniture pieces that I've done with the beds or mirrors, you probably recognize the Wylock-inspired doors on that side. Let me know, and I will make a small video showcasing how I made some of these simpler furniture pieces. Nothing too groundbreaking, but if you're interested, please leave a comment. Alright, next I'm going to show you how all of this breaks down. But you can see that the top level just slides out from resting on the walls of the second floor, and then the second floor just lifts off, and then the front facades slide out. The switch for the fireplace is on the back here, and then the pit just gets lifted out and turned off, and then we can put it all back together. I don't know if this is the most elegant solution for added playability to something this large, but I think it works. I sort of messed around with it on the table, and at least with my setup, this works great for the players that I play Dungeons & Dragons with, so I think this works out good. And then do one more shot of everything all together with some front lighting so you can see everything sort of in context. This was a super complicated and difficult build at times, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. I hope you stuck with it. I know this was a long video and I apologize for that, but I think the end product is definitely worth it. Thank you so much for stopping by. I hope to see you next time.